actually planned this way, that the food is my arm reach, so that they would want some of this for the speaker to take and then shut up quickly as they're chewing. So let me say I'm absolutely delighted to have had the opportunity to visit Daejeon, and particularly your institute, and I find just the colleagues that I've found, the newfound colleagues, to be absolutely a pleasure. And hopefully it creates an environment for enhancement of future design of chips on a global basis. So I think somebody mentioned that literally I look at the world community as this massive units that are highly connected through copper. Or we have just changed that kind of copper through visual communications or distance and so on, and hopefully that can change our platform, and together we can build a very rich environment of research. Let me just very briefly say a couple of things. Before I do that, by the way, I wanted to share a story with you because I've already shared some of the stories and the slides and everything this afternoon. And as you know, there were the three very eminent scientists from Korea, United States, and Australia. And they were talking about the developments they have done in terms of the anti-gravity machine. They had finished with the space probe, and they come with something much, much richer, the anti-gravity. The American mentioned that, look, as a group of scientists, we have worked on this machine, and we have got a plan that we want to raise 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, 1 cubic meter, 1 meter from ground. And the cost was $1 trillion. So we went up and we met up with President Bush. At the time, Bush was still in power, and he said we presented that idea, and he was absolutely enthralled, and he immediately doubled it. So it was $2 trillion. The Korean said, well, that was very nice because we are also in competition in coming up with this anti-gravity machine. But our plan is that we are proposing to the president, and at that time it was President Lee? No. And he said, but ours is 2 meters by 2 meters by 2 meters, 8 cubic meters to raise 2 meters, but we asked for 4 equivalent $1 trillion. And he immediately doubled it to $8 trillion. Of course, it collapsed the Korean economy, but we got the fund and we are going to work on it. And there was the Australian, and he says, well, you guys have done very well, but we have already invented the anti-gravity machine. And the 2 Koreans and the Americans, they jumped up and said, you invented? They said, yes. He says, well, we presented to our Prime Minister, John Howard, that was the previous one, the Liberal, of a 3 meter by 3 meter by 3 meter, which was 27 cubic meters. And we put our plan in front of him. He looked at the budget, he went straight through the roof. So this is the kind of, I think, technology that currently we are actually addressing. We are looking at that some of these budgets that are coming, and somebody commented that how do you cope with these massive amount of dollar bills and so on. So unless there is a kind of commonality and synergy that the world community to build up, we find that we are not going to get very far. Many organizations are in this very, let us say, I won't say narrow thinking, but this very tall poppy thinking, vertically looking at, without really looking at what other resources are available to us. And that applies to companies, through academia, particularly nowadays. And I can highlight the last 15 years, there has been a dramatic change in the academic scenes. The academia, the university, all of a sudden realized that if they harness the research and keep it to themselves and asking for $1 trillion for a patent, then there is going to be an incredible resource base for them. And of course, if you look at the global scenes, it is far and in between of getting $1 trillion outcome from these kind of technologies. Hasn't happened. Maybe there is a spasmodic dots, but far and in between. So what really has to change is our mentality of this interconnectivity. And one of the most fascinating thing that I can really share with you is that a lot of the machinery that was designed for a different purpose, like the war machine, you know, the internet. Do you remember in North Carolina? We started that at the time. It was a joke. It was purely as a war machine. So that if you knocked out a certain sector of the command, the other sector would take over. But what has happened? That technology has interconnected the world. And of course, everything else has brought about wonderful technology base that has changed our lives. What are the technology bases that we have worked with? We discussed very briefly that electron was discovered by J.J. Thomson. He got his master's degree from Cambridge in 1883. 1883, electron discovery. And of course, noise in the 1950, 1959, 1960 made the first integrated circuit. I won't talk about Shockley about 1947, but he came with two of the, they put two transistors, he put a couple of transistors together. And that was wonderful, we didn't appreciate it. And then what happened? I remember that as a very young engineer, I got very excited on anything that people said it cannot be done. So we were working on what we call P transistors. Some of you probably know a P transistor, but we don't, doesn't matter. As long as you got a pin that has got red and green. And if you put red over green, that becomes a P transistor. And the whole frontier of that technology was based on that. And I remember at the time Jonathan Allen from MIT, Richard Newton, Randy Katz, and Giovanni Mandel from Stanford, and so on. And I was giving a lecture on the basis of what we call complementary metal oxide semiconductors, CMOS VLSI. Very little sleep indeed, not really, very large scale integration. And these guys were there, and I had given the very first course in the United States trying to transform people's thinking, that technology wasn't difficult, but we had to think about it differently. And that was, again, comes back from the experience that I had as a young engineer at Philips. Because at the time, if you wanted to design a 30 transistors, it took about 9 months that I had to draw these boxes. And in fact, looking at this, it really reminds me of those days. I get excited because the boards were the same color, but they were raised and they had all these squares. And I had a pencil, a rubber, and a ruler. So I would sit there and draw up these boxes. And then what would happen? I get to this corner, and we got 2 transistors left over, and I couldn't fit it in here. What do you do? You begin to rub off all that, people, and start saying a few words to yourself. I couldn't speak Dutch, so I used to say it in English. And you redraw that, and then there were 80 rules you had to remember.
Design rules.
Design rules you had to remember. 80 of them. You used to go crazy. And the idea was that if you made this thing 3rd time round working, then you were a genius, really good. course, at that time, we had to think in a simple way of what we could build. And that triggered. And that took something like 15 years to germinate in my thoughts. And so I wrote the book. And it was a very simple book. It is always said that, look, you give a monkey a red and green pen, eventually we design a microprocessor. Eventually. But that was the mentality that I want people to see. With very simple rules, they could build, and the idea of correctness by construction came into existence. That if you do it this way, you increase the probability of success. And that was it changed our thinking. And of course, then it transpired that we had to, instead of being highly focused, we could move our arms across. So I moved into gallium arsenide. Why? Because the challenge of silicon at the time was dramatic. We were building a very large chip, and trying to get a signal from this corner to that corner, it took too long. So we became very bright. We thought we are very clever. We move away technology. We get away from silicon. Silicon, we were too slow. Electrons were too slow. We could go into gallium arsenide. Mobilities a little bit better, and things, the behavior aspect was different. And so all of a sudden I approached the government, and they got very excited. They gave me the whole $10,000 research grant. That's very significant, $10,000 to build an entirely new technology base.
This is in Australia?
In Australia, and it was Australian dollars.
Even, yeah, right.
Then how did I move forward? So you created synergy between different laboratories, that you could build a $500 million empire on a $10,000 budget. And the problem, of course, was very simple, that while we were working on gallium arsenide, silicon at the time was working only 50 megahertz. So we were working at 2 gigahertz. We built the first gate clocking at 2 gigahertz with a very cool technology of a company in the United States at the time. We worked very hard. We bring different people together. Silicon started hitting 500 megahertz. We were working at 2 gigahertz. Still, we were 4 times ahead. It started hitting 1 gigahertz, and I was working at 2 gigahertz. Then
Catching up fast. Catching up fast.
Very fast. And the mistake was, you see how our perception changes, because we always assess everything on what we know today.
Correct.
Sometimes we don't just see what is beyond the horizon. And I made a mistake. In a book that I published, not the first one I like it myself. I don't like the second edition because we tried to be too clever. But the first edition was very good for graduate students and teaching book. And it's still, after 25 years, still being used. But in the second book, I decided to make a cookbook. And right on the introductory chapter, I said, well, I'm giving you a cookbook. However, when the technology reaches 140 nanometer, it is the deathbed of silicon. And that was from the greatest mind on the world, the physicists and the materials people and the chemists. So you do some calculations and plots, and I found that Mendel